of manufacturing. The idea is that Africans are not trading enough with Africans. Our trade volume is very low. And so to trade within and amongst Africans means that we must increase our trade volume. If you must increase your trade volume, how do you do that? You must also expand your production capacity. In the 21st century, there is no means of increasing production capacity without industrialization. And I want to ask ourselves a question. Now, if you look at the countries that have signed on to the AfCFTA, they are countries with much smaller GDP, much smaller manufacturing capacity, and the rest of it. Now, the question I ask myself is, why would countries with much, in quotes, lesser capacity sign on, and countries with much bigger capacity, stay back? Now, take South Africa, for instance. South Africa is home to several global manufacturing companies, and that creates a lot of technical capacity within South Africa. Nigeria, we have a threefold problem, which is both institutional. Our institutions have corporate governance and ethic problems. We have regulatory problems, essentially, for instance, with our ports and borders and regulating imports and exports from time. And then we have infrastructural issues. Those are key setbacks that we should have dealt with over time. But the question again is to say, if Nigeria signs on, then it would be an acute impetus for us to be able to develop these areas to meet up with our production expansion capacity. If you look at within the ECOWAS subregion, for instance, Nigeria's major export is oil and gas. Okay? What manufacturing input is huge there? Absolutely nothing. And so the idea is to boost non-oil and gas products. And that is an area Nigeria should have taken the gauntlet and pursued to be a big player within the African continent. Because the truth is, there is no way you can increase or boost your production without necessarily industrializing. So it is the corollary and is something that Nigeria should pursue.
And that is critical to Nigeria's signing, because without an integrated industrial system, without constructing one in which produce from industrial establishments in one country could be outlet or input to industrial establishments in another country, at the end of the day, we're just selling produce among ourselves, and that won't really take, because at the end of the day, we're talking about external relations in terms of trade, imports and exports, that will lend support to our internal industrial development efforts. And if that's not there, all of this might just end in futility. The outcome, the concrete outcome, might not be the way we're hyping it.
Okay, let me ask a question in that regard. There is the North African Free Trade Agreement area agreement, which is between the United States of America, Canada, and Mexico. And I ask a question: does America trade with the outside world? Yes. Do they trade within the free trade area? Yes. So the African Continental Free Trade Agreement does not limit Africans to trade with Africans alone.
Sure, I understand.
The whole idea is there is a huge market within Africa. We're talking about $3 trillion and more within Africa alone. Have we, by any measure, been able to tap into even 50% of that value? If that is done, you will see development spread within Africa first. The idea is to give Africans industrial capacity to become competitive in the global marketplace. Now, if you don't have anything to galvanize that capacity within, you remain a dumping ground. Now, you know that in the history of Nigeria, at the point Nigeria became almost the largest importer of rice. Yet we have capacity to produce rice. We import as much as toothpaste. Don't we have the capacity for those things? Yes, we do. Now the idea is, if we must be competitive, it means we must begin to grow internally. And take for instance, Nigeria can produce enough rice to export. Not just for self-sufficiency now, we can achieve self-sufficiency in rice production and consumption and still be able to export rather than import from Thailand. Now, do you know how many countries within Africa that import rice? Equatorial Guinea here, for instance, imports most of its goods and services from within the European Union. Why can't it get it from within Africa?
But why buy from an African country a particular produce if, as a country, you know that it's advantageous and cheaper to buy that same produce from the global market?
Now, the reason why it's advantageous, in quotes, for us to buy from the global market is because most of those countries have tariff regimes for exports. I'll give you a simple instance. Trade between under the NAFTA between the US and Mexico, for instance. In the US, they can export farm produce free of charge without any tariff. And so there is no way it wouldn't land in any other country, it wouldn't land in Mexico cheaper. And so they discovered that produce within Mexico was much more expensive than imported produce from the United States of America. So that is the reason why Africans buy cheaper goods from outside, because the tariff regime is zero on those products. So if we manufacture within ourselves under the AfCFTA, there are provisions for tariffs. The idea is to reduce tariffs on certain products to make it uniform. And the idea would be that when the tariffs are adopted, you'll discover that it will be cheaper to buy within Africa than to buy globally. Why would that be? You understand how much time and cost it would entail to bring in a product, whether by ship or by air, from America, for instance. Why don't I buy from Burkina Faso if it costs me less and I can just truck it? Why not buy from Liberia, for instance, and I can just truck it? What is the cost of trucking? The cost of trucking those goods and services would depend on fuel, would depend on customs, duties, and tariffs along the borders. So if the tariffs are down and there is free movement of goods and services as envisaged, then of course you will discover that the goods might just be only the cost of transportation, and there will be no custom duties and tariffs, or less custom duties and tariffs on those products, and arrives at a cheaper value as envisaged. The idea being that if I, in Burkina Faso, can manufacture things and transport with less cost to Nigeria, Nigeria can do the same for things that are needed in Burkina Faso. The idea is cross-trading, which creates the needed financial capacity within Africa and rather props us up the more to be able to engage in competitive global trading. That's the idea.
All right. We'll begin to take your calls. The numbers to call 0816 207 0813 or 0908 127 8300. Impact of the African Continental Free Trade Area Agreement and Nigeria's Readiness Report is received by President Muhammadu Buhari yesterday. And you are our first call. Hello, good morning.
Hello, good morning.
Good morning.
Myself, my name is Comrade Rambi Frankenstein from Yenagoa.
You're welcome, sir.
What I want to contribute is that we must be very careful in issues like this. I don't doubt what your guest is saying over there. It's very versatile in terms of trade and all that. But my problem is that Africans are good in coming up with a program. At the end of the day, implementation is just a fact in most of our policies and programs. Like, for instance, our issue of the past, new partnership for African development. Okay, now we are talking about even the Millennium Development Goals. All these things, they have to come up with this document. We initiate them we initiate them within the African Union. So we are able to do anything to the letter. So my fear is that our institutions are strong enough in order to absorb these things and do it the way it's expected to be done. That is one. And my main concern is the issue of insecurity within the African continent. Because most of Nigerians have been killed. The businessmen and women have been killed to go around, intimidate every day within the continent. So I believe that this so-called African Free Trade Agreement is in combat with the issue of insecurity, to cope insecurity within the African continent. But if not, it will lead to opportunity. It cannot achieve anything. Because if other fellow Africans are killing Africa, but we are talking about we must be very, very careful. So my advice to the Nigerian government is that they must critically look that document, look at more critically in order to come up with a standard to protect. Because industrialization is not an issue of whether you go into free trade before you can be able to industrialize it. Nigerian government has the capacity to do it, but we refuse to do that because of what? Our institutions are very weak. Leadership at high level are not encouraging. They are not doing the best. So my advice to Nigeria, we must be very careful at the end of the day to see that some issue will be dealt with. Thank you very much.
Thank you. We appreciate your calling in and contributing to the show. What you've talked so far so good, and what the caller said so far so good in all of this, it's basically an attempt at economies in Africa having a shared dependency. But then, do we have a continent-wide political force to support this free trade agreement we intend going into?
Well, do we need a political force in that regard?
Surely we do, because a whole lot of countries are having problems among themselves. Nigeria and South Africa, a whole lot of problems. Nigeria and Ghana, a whole lot of problems.
Well, you're correct in that regard. But what I say is this. What are the reasons of the problems? The reasons are purely economical and not political. Xenophobia in South Africa is not as a result of politics, it's more as a result of economic gains, because South Africans say that Nigerians are taking up their economic space. And so why don't we? All over, for instance, in the Niger Delta, we say, oh, youths are jobless. It's not a creation of politics. Economy should be able to take care of joblessness, isn't it? Now, the idea is for us to create an economic blueprint country by country, using the AfCFTA as a benchmark. Have we done that? Now, the reasons for, well, the excuses are plausible for us to say, hey, security is a problem and we are not being able to, take care of ourselves security-wise or in other areas. And I said something earlier. Nigeria is the driver of the AfCFTA agreement from the 80s till date. In the past couple of 1 year is when Nigeria began to backslide. But the content of the agreement was known to us from day one. Now, is it to say that Nigeria does not see benefits in the AfCFTA? Of course not. It is simply that we don't see ourselves as ready enough to enter into the implementation phase. And the ideas that the last caller had mentioned are very clear. Now, what is the security architecture for Nigeria, for Nigerians within Nigeria? It's a big question. We are still grappling with those things when we shouldn't. But the question would be, do we have the capacity to do it? Of course, yes. Have we done it? Political will. Now, the idea about bringing African nations together under the AfCFTA is to create one political African will to do things for ourselves. In the beginning, I also, was a proponent of caution. Now, caution in what sense? Caution in the sense that we need to put our regulatory, infrastructural, and institutional capacities to the optimum. Have we done that? Of course not. Must we wait until we do that to be a part of this? Of course not. Now, must we wait until our customs are ready to be a part of the African, free trade agreement area before we sign? We may never be ready. Must we wait until our institutions have corporate governance and ethics issues solved before we join the AfCFTA? Of course not. We may never be ready. We have infrastructural issues. Do we wait until government has infrastructural issues all in place before we sign? Of course not. We may never be ready. Now, look at smaller nations that are able to put their infrastructural issues in place. Are they better than we are? Of course not. What are the problems that we have? Simple excuses within and amongst ourselves. Do we have a working industrial policy for Nigeria as we speak? Those are critical issues that we need to ask ourselves. Do we need to have one in tandem with the driving of the AfCFTA so that we can see ourselves as a competitor first within Africa and then globally? We need to consider those things. Now, take for instance, we all know in the 90s and the 80s, we had huge manufacturing outfits in Nigeria because power was comparatively stable. Where are those manufacturing outfits? They moved out to neighboring smaller countries that have had their acts together in this regard. Now ask me, do we have the capacity to have 24 hours a day electricity? Yes, we do. Are we working on that? I can't answer.
But it's beautiful you highlighting all of these inadequacies on the part of Nigeria. That means if we go into this agreement, despite our size, despite our market size, we will not derive enough benefits to our satisfaction.
Okay, now I ask a question. When will we be ready? Now, take for instance power, which is critical to manufacturing and production. Do we have the capacity to increase power production? Yes. What have we done about it in the past couple of years? Absolutely nothing. We have IPPs. How much of those IPPs are working? Nigeria generates much of its power by 90% or more through dams that are seasonal. If there is a flood during the rainy season, the flood waters are high and the dams can operate in maximum capacity. In the dry season, what happens? Power outages here and there.
Can we take a call, sir?
Oh, go ahead.
Hello.
Hello, good morning. Maybe it's me, back rapping.
Okay.
I just want to ask a question. Hello, sir.
Go ahead. You.
Okay, I want to ask your guest, how far have we got the issue of the common currency in Africa? Because we believe that one of the cardinal issues about this is the common currency among African countries. What have we done about that in order to drive this issue of this free trade agreement? Thank you, sir.
I think common currency will be part of this agreement.
Of course it will be. But it's not an immediate thing. For instance, even the European Union didn't have a common currency from day one. Okay? Even at the level of the ECOWAS, the common ECOWAS currency is still in the planning. Now, the idea, we are skeptical about things because we probably don't have the political will to drive it. Is that a problem of Africa? Now, if we have that problem and we know we have it, shouldn't we see the African Continental Free Trade Agreement arrangement as a way for us to overcome these things?
But I think Nigeria is not the only country that's skeptical about this agreement. There are a lot of countries with strong economies. South Africa is one of them, expressing fears and worries. And so, despite that, we have all of these inadequacies. There are areas these countries and governments might be thinking that it's not a wise thing to delve deep into this from the word go. And so, you and I are not in government to know why, even if it's beautiful. Of course, trade, there are benefits, there are, and then merits and demerits. There are upsides and downsides to this agreement, without a doubt. And the report will capture all of that. We're not in government to understand why this should not happen immediately. But when you see strong countries, big countries, influential countries with strong economies saying, wait a minute, we'll take our time to make this decision, certainly could be a reason to that.
Well, you see, every country usually would want to protect its economy.
Sure.
Now, protect in the sense that they would not want their economies to be open to several incursions. I use the word incursions carefully. Now,
unfortunately, our time is 8 o'clock. Let's pause. It's a minute. Let's pause for news around the world. We'll get back to the show proper as soon as we return.